Undertale and Deltarune share many elements in common, and not only because both games are Toby Fox's. They share characters, mechanics, sounds. There are parallels in their stories. They may share the same mysterious character in the background. But something that deeply differentiates both video games is the existence of Dark Worlds. Yes, sure. It's true that in Undertale we already had a dichotomy between the underground and the surface, but we never really got to play in the latter, and the underground is something real, unique, and part of the same world. However, each Dark World is like a new world, which is born and closed in its chapter, being to a great extent independent and very different thematically, which allows Toby to deploy all his creativity without having to rely too much on what was exposed before, beyond the essentials and some narrative connections. But despite the fact that we have known the Dark Worlds for years, and all the new information that the second chapter of Deltarune has given us, we still have many shadows and doubts around them. What are they really? Do they exist or not? Have other characters visited them before us? What's their origin? What relationship do they share? And what other Dark Worlds could appear in the following chapters? Stay until the end, because today's video is very, very interesting. It's undeniable that things have changed a lot since the first chapter of Deltarune was published back in 2018. Back then, the theory that seemed to prevail over the rest, probably because it came from MatPat, was that the first Dark World of Deltarune, along with Lancer, the King, Sean, Starwalker, and all its inhabitants, was Kris's role-playing game or fantasy dream, throwing away the relevance of anything we could see in those wonderful worlds, except the impact they could have on our character. Some people already strongly defended at the time that this was not the case based on the egg, the only object obtained in the Dark World that remains unchanged when returning to our world. But now, with what we've seen in the second chapter and its consequences, I doubt anyone still thinks Dark Worlds are not something real as far as possible, or at least something with tangible consequences to Kris's and Susie's world. Right, Birdley? But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. As Flowey wielding a knife would say, let's do it one limb at a time. To begin with, let's talk about how a Dark World is born, given that, in theory, we now know their origin. In the first chapter, we were told very little about them. We were only told about the Dark Fountain, and we could guess that it was what created that world. But in Chapter 2, both the Queen and Ralsei confirmed it completely. The first one tells us how the knight, raising their hand towards the sky and cursing their will on a blade, created the Dark Fountain that gave rise to Cyberworld. And the Goat Boy confirmed that Dark Worlds reflect the will of their fountain, which is no other than the will or determination of the knight. But this leaves us with more questions than a Spamton talk about NFTs, since it doesn't seem to make sense that despite the fact that they have been recently created, they have history and lore of their own. In the first one, which we know is of recent creation, we are mentioned that there were 4 kings, Jevil's imprisonment, Lancer's father's coup d'etat, and in the second one it's even clearer since it was created that same day. But we are already told about a past in which the Queen did not rule with an iron fist, and an entire history for Spamton that goes back to 1997, despite Deltarune theoretically taking place in 2020X. How is it possible that a Dark World that isn't even a day old has years and years of previous lore? And the weirdest thing of all is that in both of them, we are told about other people from the Light World, when no one else could have been able to fall in there, and no one on the surface seems to know about their existence. At the schools one, the king and their inhabitants talk about a time when they lived with the Lightners until they were abandoned and locked up there, while in the cyberworld, several residents tell us that they haven't seen any of them for quite some time, that they did not pay attention to Spamton's products, or even that Spamton Neo's body was created by a Lightner. How can all this be possible? Having a history or interacting with people from the Light World when they didn't even exist? Well, the only possible option is the one we suspected from the beginning. The Dark World's characters are what they seem, objects in a room, like Toy Story but in VR. When a dark fountain is summoned in an enclosed space, it creates a dark world as far as its darkness reaches, generating a world based on the objects in that space, and on what they had already lived as objects too. A whole story and lore are created based on them. That's why those Darkners already have interacted with Lightners, because they really played with them until they stopped using that classroom. That's why Lightners didn't look at Spamton, because he literally was spam mails. And so on with each and every one of them.
Okay. We already knew that they are objects since Chapter 2, from the moment we carry them over our head from the classroom to the closet and they appear in town, or directly with the first Dark World being a representation of how the toys had been left on the floor. But they aren't just literal objects that come to life thanks to a dark fountain, are they? There must be something else.
Well, not really. That's it. Objects that take on a personality and a previous history according to what they had already lived as objects. And in fact, although now they can express it in a different way, they still behave as objects. Ralsei tells us that Lancer feels good about helping Susie and Kris because that's his purpose. Darkner's purpose is to assist us. It's the only way they feel truly fulfilled as the objects they are. In fact, this gives new meaning to some of Sean's lines.
Lightness. Long ago, the darkness lived in harmony with the lightness. They were like gods to us, our protectors, our creators, those who gave us purpose. Then one day we were all locked away in this prison, and the lightness never returned.
That's why people from the light world are referred to as gods, protectors, or creators, because they truly are, either by having created those toys or by giving them a purpose by playing with them. But that's not all. King's words also change their perspective.
There once was a time where darkness and lightness lived in harmony, a time where the darkness could fulfill their purpose in peace.
It's not that those lightners visited the dark world, it was simply that they played with them while they were mere toys. And that's why when they left, he also tells us that they were stripped of all meaning, because if no one played with them, they couldn't feel fulfilled. They couldn't fulfill their purpose. What's a toy without a child to play with it? Or an online program without the internet? Almost nothing. Something totally useless. And now that we know what the Dark Worlds are in essence and how they are created, let's go one step further. Like Sans with Kris's mother, is there anything that unites them? Any relationship that justifies why they were created both in the school and in the computer lab? Well, I would say yes. I think they're places that represent the link between Starwalker and Nubbert. Nah, just kidding. Between Kris and Asriel. It's true that it's not a very strong argument at the moment, but we know that Kris has some kind of connection with the Dark Fountains, and we may be able to extrapolate it. It's obvious that at school they had to spend time together at some point, since Kris still remembers which locker was their brother's, right next to theirs. However, Asriel has gone off to college. For the computer lab, we had to be more attentive to see the connection, since this time it is Alphys who tells us that Kris stayed up until late chatting online with Asriel. And even in the Dark World, we can find a room that represents Asriel's search history. But Kris doesn't want to go inside because they have a feeling they wouldn't learn anything, surely implying that they already know him precisely for having shared time with Asriel. So what happened this time to separate them? The town's internet has stopped working, and Kris can't chat with their brother anymore. And finally, for Chapters 3 Dark Fountain, we learned that Asriel and Kris used to play video games like Mario, or the not-at-all fake Super Smashing Fighters on that same TV, until Asriel left. In fact, we're highlighted several times that the TV was dusty, and even unplugged in the first chapter, surely implying that Kris hasn't used it again since their brother's departure. And seeing Chapter 3's theme, maybe not only without playing video games, but also without watching movies or TV in general. Maybe what links all these places together is Kris's nostalgia and sadness, who we already know is not very cheerful. But in case we have discovered the Dark Fountain's creation pattern, could we try to predict the following Dark Worlds? What other places do we know that have a connection between Kris and Asriel, or they just remind them of their brother? Well, I have 3 main candidates. Firstly, we have the church, where Asriel confessed Kris's sins and went to choir, and we even get mention of them going to mass all together as a family. Even the angel itself could be an interesting element, since we know they both tried to make one as children. Secondly, Asgore's store. Either the closed door at the back, the room with the 7 flowers, or the truck itself. Not only because it's their father's store, but because Asgore tells us that when Asriel comes back, they could all go to have dinner together and take a ride in his truck, like in the old days. And finally, QC's restaurant, since the waitress tells us that they went there every Sunday, and Asriel asked her for a hot chocolate for Kris, which is reinforced when we have one, and Kris's throat closes out of pure nostalgia. I think these are the places most likely to come up in future chapters, but I also have other candidates that could be limping somewhere. The lake, where Onionson tells us when Kris tries to name him Asriel II, that the name sounded familiar, that it was like a memory, and that Asriel used to throw popcorn at him. The catch would be that it's an open space, and for the time being we don't know if it's even possible. Probably until we play Chapter 3 and see why Kris opened his house's door before creating the third Dark Fountain. And the graveyard, where we learn that, when they were young, Noelle, Des, Kris and Asriel went to play and explore there together. Noelle tells us that she misses it, and I don't think Kris's case is any different. But, again, it's an open space. Obviously, there are reasons for more places like the bunker, the hospital, or Noelle's house, but I don't want to make an endless video about this, and I preferred to stick to memories that Kris could have with Asriel. Like that headband with little red horns that Kris had to look like their brother, and that they have lost. Although we may have already found it. But if you are not convinced with the relationship between Kris and Asriel being the link, don't worry, because a second possible connection could be that Dark Worlds are places where objects have lost their purpose. The toys have been locked in the classroom with no one to play with them, the computer lab has been left without internet, and the living room TV hasn't been used for years. This causes all darkness that appear as a result of these objects to feel empty, and to have the need of desperately seeking for a new purpose. In the first Dark World, the king sees the fountain as an opportunity to create his own world for his people and take revenge on the Lightners. And in the second one, the queen wants to spread darkness beyond the computer lab to expand her mansion so she can continue helping people now that there is no internet. Although in the end we discovered, thanks to Ralsei, that if darkness spreads, the opposite of what both kings want would happen, since all darkners would be turned into stone, and the Lightners, the ones that truly give them a reason to exist, would disappear. This could indicate that they don't really know what they are doing, or that someone is deceiving them into wanting to create these fountains. Is the night causing these new purpose-seeking intentionally? Or is it collateral damage and their intentions go beyond the Darkners? Beyond even Kris, in case it's not Kris. Who benefits when more dark fountains are created? But there are still many other questions. How do you explain Jevil knowing about the existence of Queen when the cyber world has not yet been created? And it's pretty difficult for a card from a classroom to know about a computer from the library. Or how is it that Ralsei can travel between dark worlds even when there is a physical separation between them and without turning into stone? What is the origin of the closet's dark fountain and what could be its relationship with Kris? But above all, how can I be as cool as Starwalker? We'll have to wait to see what Toby Fox brings us with the next chapters. But in the meantime, subscribe so you don't miss the deep lore of your favorite video games. Thank you very much for your time, and see you in the next video.